Let's hear that one more time. This chord. So in this video, I'd like to continue my exploration of various music theory concepts and talk about half diminished chords, also sometimes referred to as minor 7 flat 5. It can also be referred to as the Tristan chord. And yeah, I'd like to just break down how to use this chord and various examples, as well as just kind of laying out what the chord looks like and how to find it on the keyboard so that you can use it in your own compositions. So what we just heard is something like this. And this right here is the half diminished chord. If you know diminished chords, you could think of it as like an F sharp diminished, except that you just tweak the top note, you raise it by a semitone to an E in this case, and you keep all the other notes the same, and that gives you the half diminished chord. Or you could think of it, if you know a minor 7th chord, so this is just your F sharp minor, add the 7th, which is the E, and then you just tweak the 5th of the chord, in this case a C sharp, and you drop that by a semitone. So instead of this, which is an F sharp minor 7, you get this, which is an F sharp minor 7 flat 5, or half diminished. If you're even more new to this, a way that you could find the chord is simply by counting it out. So F sharp, then we're going to count 1, 2, 3, that's our second note of the chord. We're going to keep that, and then we're going to go 1, 2, 3, that's our third note of the chord, and then we're going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. So let's do that again, starting on a different note. So this time, if we wanted to find a D half diminished, or D minor 7 flat 5, then here's our D. We can go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and then 1, 2, 3, 4. That's one way of doing it. Or we can just think D diminished and then tweak the top note. That gives us D half diminished. Or we can think D minor 7 and then just tweak the 5th of the chord down like that. So as is the case with all chords, we have here our sort of most basic form of it, but we can also do what are called inversions, which is where we just switch the order of the notes. So rather than having the D at the bottom, we sort of move everything along and we put the F at the bottom and put the D at the top. So it's all the same notes, just in a different order. And similarly, we can do the same thing, but this time with an A flat at the bottom. And it's always these 4 notes, A flat, C, D, F, but they're just appearing in different permutations, different orders. So those are inversions. And then we can also do different voicings. So this would be called a closed position voicing. But for example, we could take this note and drop it down an octave, and then keep all the other notes the same, and we get a voicing like that. Or if we move the whole thing up an octave, like this. Here's another type of voicing for the same D half diminished. So it's all the same notes, just a slightly different spacing. This is quite an open spacing. We might want to double the D there. So the thing to just remember with inversions and voicings is that they're all the same chord, and they all have basically the same sort of flavor, and they'll function in the same way, all of these different inversions and voicings. It's just that they have a slightly subtly different feeling. Some feel more open, some feel more dense. But in terms of the quality, there's something about all of those which is kind of staying the same, because it's still the same collection of notes all working together in harmony. Don't worry about learning every possible inversion or every possible voicing. I would recommend just getting comfortable finding this one, just starting on any note. The important thing is just to get comfortable accessing that sound world. So now, before I go on to talk about this chord in relationship to other chords, let's just dwell on the chord itself. Just spend some time kind of soaking up the sound of this chord as its own sort of characteristic sound world. So I'm just going to do a little bit of improvisation. In my head, I'm just thinking this is a 1 chord jam, if you like. everything I was playing there, apart from a few little connecting notes and a few little sort of spice notes, was just all based around this one kind of pool of notes. I was thinking of it as very static. And obviously in score music, sometimes that's what you want. You just want to kind of create an atmosphere and sustain that atmosphere. Particularly in the video games work that I do, you often are creating these loops, and each loop needs to kind of just say one thing emotionally. Interestingly, you could think of this chord as playing quite a particular role in the sort of history of music. When it comes to this sort of more atmosphere creation way of approaching composition, the Tristan Chord, which is a reference to the Wagner opera Tristan and Isolde, was one of the first examples in music history, in Western classical music history, where the chord itself was kind of a sort of riff or a motif that you'd kind of hear at multiple points during the opera, and it would kind of catch your ear, and it would sort of feel like it meant a certain thing, in the same way that a character theme might sort of evoke a certain thing. This chord actually is the precursor to a lot of scoring music and a lot of game music, which uses harmony rather than melody to kind of be a feature. Let me just play you this little excerpt from the Tristan and Isolde using this chord in quite a particular way. So there's our chord. This is actually a F. You can think of it as an F half diminished. And yeah, it's kind of the music really draws attention to that moment, to that arrival of that particular chord. The way that it's orchestrated, there's no harmony, there's no accompaniment, and then this chord comes in, and it's a real sort of moment. It really draws attention to itself. It has a very particular kind of yearning, shadowy sort of quality. So, you know, I don't want to put words in your mouth. You know, these things always strike us individually in slightly different ways, but for me, when I was playing around in that half-diminished Soundworld, yeah, it's kind of a little uneasy, or it can feel kind of a bit mysterious or magical or a bit open. It's not necessarily kind of threatening. For example, if I use a harp here and I do something like this, which is all just the same F minor 7 flat 5 or F half diminished, it has a very different feel. But I would say it still has this kind of sort of light and shade, kind of slightly glistening or slightly hard to pin down kind of feeling. And so this kind of riff, you might be familiar from Zelda. The Great Fairy Fountain uses that sort of thing as a intro. You know, it's associated with magic in that context, and it makes total sense. In film music composition and game music composition, the diminished chord is often associated with tension. It's a way of creating kind of a sense of, you know, it's kind of like, oh, something, danger, you know. It doesn't make you think, oh, that's nice and relaxing. It sort of goes right back to the silent movie days, you know. That kind of thing, you know. It's sort of, we don't kind of ham it up quite that much these days, but nevertheless, you know, diminished chords, they sort of feel like they literally almost slip between the cracks between major and minor chords. They're a bit hard to pin down. They're kind of transitionary chords in nature, and maybe that's, you know, part of the reason they're associated with sort of this chaotic feeling. But half diminished chords, I sometimes think of them as a sort of slightly light version of a diminished seventh, you know, because you've got that tweaked bit at the top. It just kind of opens up the sound slightly and kind of nudges it slightly in the direction of something a bit more settled to me. I'm going to give a couple of examples of common ways of incorporating this chord into a sequence of other chords. But do remember that with all of this stuff, it's very much a case of if it sounds good, it is good. It's not that these are the correct ways of using the chords or that you need to kind of follow these as rules necessarily. But that being said, let's have a look at the most common way of, or the most common context in which you'll hear the half diminished chord, and that is in the context of a minor 2-5 or a minor 2-5-1. Actually, the Elgar that you heard right at the beginning is an example of this kind of use of a half diminished. It's a classic use of a half diminished, and that is a half diminished chord which is used as a way of preparing the dominant chord in a minor key. So let's have another listen to that. So we're in E minor, and then here it comes. That's our half diminished, and then it's a B7 after that, so which is the 5 chord. Half diminished here. Our 5 chord in E minor, which is B7, and then we kind of expect it to go to E minor again, like 5-1, just because that's a really typical progression, but instead it goes to the 6, so it's a little bit cheeky. So that's half diminished as a way of preparing the 5 chord. So in relation to E minor, F sharp is the 2 because it's the second degree of the E minor scale. 1 chord, 2 half diminished, 5, 7, and then 1. So yeah, that's a minor 2-5-1 in a classical context, which to me gives it quite a rich sound. It's quite a rich type of color to reach for, this kind of this is the half diminished here, and then yeah, a little bit dense or a little bit kind of, I don't know, a little bit stormy kind of feeling. So that's, that's how it strikes me. In a jazz context, minor 2-5-1s are talked about quite a lot because it's one of those chord progressions that's become a bit of a sort of stock progression. You hear it a lot in jazz standards. So in Fly Me to the Moon, for example, so we're in A minor, goes to D minor, and then F, and then here's our minor 2-5-1, so B half diminished to E7, or you might do E7 flat 9. So once again, we're using the half diminished chord as a way of preparing the dominant chord, the 5 chord, in a minor key. That's called a minor 2-5-1, and it's common both in classical music and also in jazz, and in genres that sort of come out of jazz, like Broadway and show tunes, and some pop music as well. Latin styles of jazz, you'll hear this quite a lot. So I was just cycling around that C minor, and then D half diminished, and then G7. So the 1, 2, 5, 1. I won't go into detail about everything that I was doing there, but if you just Google for how to play over a minor 2-5-1 or minor 2-5-1 jazz piano or minor 2-5-1 jazz voicings or something like that, you'll come up with lots of material that can give you some ideas to practice if you like. Let's just quickly go through a few other musical contexts in which you might hear a half diminished chord. So just building on what we just discussed, a minor 2-5-1, we could do the same thing but resolving into a major key instead, and that would sound like this. So in C major, that was, I guess, quite a Henry Mancini kind of vintage Hollywood sort of sound. We already mentioned the Tristan chord, or the Tristan in his older opera by Wagner. Here's what's going on there harmonically. So the way that I would personally gloss this is just by thinking, oh, with a half diminished chord, it sounds quite cool when I drop down a semitone and I play a dominant seventh on that chord. So, for example, if we start on G half diminished, then I'm going to think, okay, I'm going to need to go to F sharp, dominant seventh, and I'll maybe throw in a sharp 11 there because that sounds cool. And then just do the same thing down a semitone. So a half diminished on F, then dominant seventh with the sharp 11th, so that's one little sound world, one little sequence that you could practice. Another approach that we could use as a jumping off point, especially in those situations where we just want something quite static, we can start with a major chord and then play the half diminished based off the same root note. So for example, if I play a D major chord and then go to a D half diminished and then go back to the D, then you get something quite moody and atmospheric, and that could be inflected a lot of different ways depending on how you choose to orchestrate that, or what register of the keyboard, whether it's really high or whether it's really low. In a lot of pop music and gospel music, it's very common to go to the 4 chord, in this case F major, go to the 5 chord, which is kind of our question, and then resolve. So 1, 4, and 5 are the most common chords to sort of oscillate around, often in a pop music or kind of gospel music context. One thing that I can do with half diminished is sort of treat it as if it were a 5 chord, sort of instead of a 5 chord. So as a way of kind of rounding off a musical sentence, I might normally go like this, but instead I could do something like this. The final example I want to give, which is again slightly different, is the idea of oscillating between your 1 chord and the 2 chord half diminished. So for example, in C major, the 1 chord is C, and the 2 chord in this case is a D, D something, we're going to say D half diminished. So actually, full disclosure, I'm using a C major 6 here, so it has a slightly more kind of clustery sound. And I'm interspersing that with a D half diminished. So I'm just thinking 1, 2 half diminished. And I'm kind of going between those two. So here's it in root position. 1 chord, 2 chord. And if I do an inversion and another inversion, that kind of thing. Twiddly, tweety kind of things. Just to finish off, as a sort of bonus tip, I'd like to show you how the notes of the half diminished chord can be spelled different ways, which just means that there are different ways of kind of contextualizing these notes. So here we're contextualizing it in terms of a D. We're thinking of it as a D type chord. But as you might have noticed, if I do an inversion and have the F at the bottom instead, it kind of looks like an F minor chord, except with an extra note. It's kind of like a particularly spicy or maybe slightly edgy version of a F minor. Here's normal F minor. Here's F minor 6, great sound, but that's just derived from the same chords, the same notes that we were just playing with. The other thing we can do is if we have our half diminished chord here and count 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps down, and make that our root note instead, we end up with this dominant chord, this dominant 7th chord with a 9 on the top. It's just a particularly nice and interesting and cool sounding dominant 7th chord. So it's the sort of thing that if you have a dominant 7th in your piece, you could kind of spice it up and use this type of dominant 7th voicing instead. It just sounds a bit richer. And then if we go down another couple of semitones, so now we're using G in the bass, which is a 5th away from the D here. We're going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 half steps down, and we're having G in the bass, and that gives us a kind of G type chord, quite a sort of moody G chord. So again, to me this sounds like a dominant 7th. So if I was in C minor, and I go to the 5 chord, instead of just playing a G 7th, I could play this kind of chord, or I could invert it. Again, it's like a very rich and slightly more intense or stormy version of a dominant 7th chord. So that's something you can think about, and just a great thing to do generally. When you find a new sort of shape or a new sort of chord voicing, you can experiment with trying different bass notes underneath it and seeing what different combinations give you, and just basically using your ears and deciding, oh, I like that, I might try and use that, in a different kind of context. So yeah, I would definitely have some fun with that. So that's it. I wanted to give this little high-level overview of the topic of half-diminished chords, what they are, how to kind of construct them, and then looking at it as a particular sort of sound world or color that you can access, and then also looking at it in the context of some other surrounding chords, just as an example of what you can do with them. But as always, if it sounds good to you, if you stumble across a way of using it that isn't represented in this video, definitely just go for it. Your ears are your best guide as to what is good. So if it sounds good, then it is good. And yeah, all that remains to say is let me know any questions that you have. Thanks for joining me on another music theory video, composing tip, and good luck with all of your compositions. Hope to see you on the next video. Take care.